নমস্কার, কফি হাউস এক্সপিরিয়েন্সের এই পর্বে আপনাদের সবাইকে স্বাগত। আমি সৌমিক। আমাদের আজকের অতিথি হিসেবে আছেন প্রফেসর জনম মুখার্জি। জনম মুখার্জি রায়ারসন ইউনিভার্সিটিতে ইতিহাসের গবেষক। আমি ডক্টর মুখার্জির ফ্যাকাল্টি পেজ থেকে কিছু লাইন পড়ে শোনাচ্ছি আপনাদের। ডক্টর মুখার্জি's primary research focuses on colonial India in the 1940s. His first book, Hungry Bengal, War, Famine, Riots, and the End of the Empire, 1939 to 1946, published by Oxford University Press in 2015, examines three interrelated crises that shaped the social, economic, and political context of pre-partition Bengal, the Second World War in India, the Bengal Famine of 1943, and the Calcutta riots of 1946. Janam Mukherjee is also an anti-war activist and creative writer. আমাদের আজকের ডিসকাশনের বিষয় হবে বেঙ্গল ফ্যামিন অফ 1943। আমরা সেই নিয়ে মোস্টলি ইংলিশে কথা বলবো আজকে। আমরা শুরু করছি তাহলে। ডক্টর মুখার্জি, my first question to you would be, this project of investigating the causes of and the impact of the Bengal famine of 1943, how personal was this project for you? I have been reading your thesis, and you mention a lot of personal anecdotes in your thesis. You mention how your father was gravely impacted by the events of the tumultuous decade of 40s in Bengal. You mention how, as a child, the intergenerational grief of that decade was passed to you from your father. Give us a brief overview of the journey that took you from Michigan to Kolkata in search of the causes of one of the darkest episodes of Bengali history.
Try to be brief, and I apologize for not conducting this in Bangla. As I said to you over email, my Bengali is okay conversationally, but it's difficult for me to express really with any depth my work and certainly the journey behind my work, which is critical to how I look at the history that I've written about. In my life at 18 years old, I left home, left school, and I traveled widely at that time, working any number of jobs. I was kind of the ultimate angry young man in many ways. And I only came to Calcutta the first time when I was 32 years old in 1999. And by that time, kind of trying to understand the kind of emotions that motivated me in my young adulthood, the bohemianism that I partook in, the kind of rough life I lived, the kind of energies behind my life were so contradictory to my father's energies, which were, my father was a very gentle man, a very quiet man, and I came to understand a very sorrowful man. And looking at his life and trying to understand his life became more and more important to me through my 20s. And I realized that, you know, the stories that he had told me of this period of time living through as a child, through the famine, through war, through the bombing of Calcutta, and then through the Calcutta riots, especially of 1946. My family's house was lost at that time. They spent many years homeless, dislocated as refugees. And so much of, I think, my father's quietude was about a deep sorrow that he carried with him and a deep trauma. And I think that my understanding of that from childhood was very minimal because he didn't share a lot of stories. But I do think that those stories were germinating inside of me, and they were somehow transferred to me, a kind of intergenerational memory almost in a very seminal form. So I traveled to Calcutta on my own in '99. I wasn't connected with any university. I came to investigate the roots of his childhood. I met my family at that time, my Jetta and Jettima, and many others who told me then, reiterated those stories and reinforced those stories that my father had told me, and went deeper and deeper then into the history of the 1940s, mostly in conversation with people from that generation, people who had survived those times. And at that time, I stayed in Calcutta about a year and a half, and I recognized that I had just really been able to access the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of this history, and that it would take huge effort and many years to really excavate the complete stories. And so I joined the university in 2002 and began a PhD in 2004, and then spent the next 10 years researching this period of time from many different angles, both through oral history as well as through archival research and other kinds of research. So that in a nutshell is, so I very personally dedicated. I mean, it began as a personal journey indeed of understanding my father, but also understanding myself. And, you know, I do think in conclusion of all the work I've done, the way these kind of memories impact us, the next generation, and even generations thereafter, are mysterious, but profound. You know, now we have all this work coming about epigenetics and actual kind of genetic translation of memory and experience, particularly of trauma. But I think that it's even much more complex than simple kind of epigenetics. What is relayed to us through those closest to us, through gestures, through speech, through manner of being, through all sorts of not obvious ways. I think that, you know, when we're close to someone, we reassemble those experiences in some definite way, and they impact our lives in quite profound ways. Certainly my life.
In your PhD thesis, you mentioned that you started researching the Calcutta riots of 1946, and then you switched to investigating the Bengal famine of 1943. You mention a few anecdotes in your thesis about how gravely your father was impacted by the Calcutta riots of 1946. You mentioned how the house that you lived in that was attacked. And then you also talk about this very interesting scene from a film called Akale Shandhane by Mrinal Sen, where there's a bunch of city dwellers who come to a village searching for famine, like trying to make a film about the famine. And there's a villager who remarks that the famine can be found everywhere. Is it also the same premise that led you to like look into the Bengal famine when you were talking about the Calcutta riots? Was the famine to be found everywhere in the decade of 1940s in Bengal?
Yeah, you know, I began with the Calcutta riots because it's kind of the foundation story of my family in many ways. My father's leaving Calcutta, he left in 1957, and the riots, the dislocation that my family suffered, is still to this day a kind of foundational story. My family, in many ways, took, you know, decades to recoup from the riots. So the riots were such a central focus. I also had a very strange idea that I had in my own being, a kind of reflection of those riots in my own consciousness. So I came very much to investigate the riots. What I found was very little work on the riots, academic work or historical work. Explanations of the riots that people advanced were very brief, were very simplistic. And when you start looking at the larger picture of Bengal at that time, impacted people much more, what impacted society in a much kind of longer period of time, also culturally and politically, as well as economically, was really the famine. So the famine is, to me, the underlying context of the whole 40s. And one of the important things I'm trying to do in my work is to really expand the frame. Famine, also often known as the Bengal Famine of 1943. But when you look at the work of, say, Sugata Bose, others who have worked on the economy of the 1930s even, you find people sinking into deeper and deeper destitution in the World War I era, in the post-Depression era. By the end of the 1930s, many of the poor of Bengal had mortgaged their land, had sold off their movable possessions. The credit system in Bengal had dried up. So even at the advent of World War II in 1939, you have people really on the, in deep destitution. Indeed, there's a book called Recovery Plan for Bengal, written in 1934, where the author Mitter mentions that people in 1934 are starving. So 1943 is really the culmination of a very long duration of poverty and economic struggle, as well as profound hunger that is deeply seated. And 43 also, the famine doesn't end. Amartya Sen's work, in his demographic work, he looks at famine deaths and increased mortality until 1946. He ends his study of mortality in 1946 specifically because then you have the violence of partition and the dislocations of partition. But indeed, people are still going hungry in 1946. And through the 50s and 60s as well. So I've often asked, did the Bengal famine ever really end? And we're in a circumstance now with the total dislocation of the economy related to COVID, where people, again, who have been living for generations on the very margins and the very edge of subsistence, are being pushed over the cliff and can't but be going hungry and indeed starving at this very moment in this crisis situation that we're facing now. So I think that there's a tendency to bracket famine and define it as that spectacle of mass death through starvation. But famine needs to be understood in a historical trajectory of disempowerment, of economic dislocation, of destitution, of chronic hunger as well, if we are to really get a hold of it.
Yeah, so actually, I have a follow-up question to that. That when you say that famine as a generic term, like it's technical term, how do you actually define it? When you know that certain region, geographical or political region enters into famine with like you see some parameters, or what's the exact definition of that?
It's interesting because there are definitions given in things like the Bengal Famine Code and other analyses of famine in present day through the FAO, the UN Food Administration Organization, etc. And these criteria often involve the number of people who are going without food for certain periods of time, the number of people often who will seek relief in terms of food, and other criteria. Famine, in some ways, is a very slippery term, right? During 1940s in Bengal, famine was never declared.
Right.
So famine can easily be the kind of categorization of a particular event as famine is as political many times as it is a kind of actually biophysical or societal. And I think that political definition of famine is often quite deceptive. So I think I prefer to talk about hunger and the extent of deprivation that people are experiencing at any given moment. for that reason.
Right.
Jumping straight into the events that shaped the Bengal famine, as you mentioned so rightly, sir, that this was not a one-off economic dislocation. This had been in the works since the mid-1930s due to a mix of different British policies and the conditions of the time. The war was just knocking at the door, etc. So in 1934, Satish Chandra Mittur had published a book called A Recovery Plan for Bengal, in which he had expressly painted a grim picture of rural Bengal, where he described it as, it is evident to anyone familiar with agricultural conditions and with the lives of the cultivators that they exist rather than live, and that the margin between starvation and existence is an extremely small one. So the first part to my question would be, so if you could just give us a sense of the times in terms of, we are at the cusp of 1940s, the World War II is upon us. How do the different socio-economic and cultural contexts emerge to create the Bengal famine? The second part to my question is something you wrote very early on in the book. For any sort of Western calamity or any sort of Western strifes, you tend to use, in addition to socio-cultural reasons, you tend to use economic reasons to justify the strife. But for Indian events or Asian events in general, we tend to only focus on the cultural and not on the socio-political or economic. So I just want to understand, why do you feel so?
I'll take that second one first and return to the first. You know, this is the great sleight of hand of Western dominance in the world. When brown people or black people go to, engage in civil conflict, it is almost universally, the definition in the West is that there's some deep cultural hatreds and animosity at play. People are acting irrationally, et cetera, et cetera. Yet in the West, every time there is crisis and upheaval socially, there are always economic definitions or understanding. So we see in Nazi Germany the question of hyperinflation in the 20s and early 30s being always included. We see even in the US Civil War, the depressions and the economic crises of the 1840s and 1850s always being included as kind of determining factors. But in the global South, there's an attempt to erase economic understandings and the extent to which in many ways, much more dire poverty and disempowerment of non-Europeans and non-Western peoples impacts their social and cultural worlds, as well as their political worlds. So, I think to reintroduce some economic analysis, historical analysis that focuses on poverty, that focuses on disempowerment, that focuses on the oppression of colonialism and neo-colonialism in the more modern world is essential indeed. I think even non-Western scholars slip into this more culturalist mode when talking about people of the global South. And yet across the planet today, whether it's in Asia or in Africa or in South and Central America, the economic circumstances of people and the kind of despair, the kind of frustrations, the kind of animosities then that these kind of conditions breed are often entirely left out. So this was a very important kind of factor in my own research to reintroduce or to insist. Some few reviews have suggested that my analysis is economic determinism. I'm pretty careful not to be a kind of simplistic economic determinist. What I'm saying is that these factors, my God, must matter. You have millions of people dying of hunger, And yet that's written out from the political animosities of the mid 40s leading up to partition. Can that really be the case, that people subjected to that kind of pressure of destitution, of despair, of hunger, of starvation, of territorial also pressures then, can it really be that these simply don't impact society? In India, it's a mystery how these things happen in historical analysis. As far as the conditions leading to the real crisis of starvation by 1943, I think the overwhelming factor has to be understood as war. The war itself and the idea of a state of emergency where the only consideration is the war effort, what is beneficial to the war effort, what is essential, including various populations who are categorized as essential, meaning that various other populations are non-essential and eventually entirely disposable. So you have, war being the overarching ideological factor, in my mind, that leads to an erasure of consideration. But there's so many other factors at play. You also have the capital kind of industrial production in and around Calcutta that is related again to the war effort, but is also running according to its own logic of kind of maximal increase profits. And that's in the war manufacturing industries of Europeans and Indians alike. So the kind of industrial houses in Calcutta, in and around Calcutta and Howrah mostly, are producing textiles and munitions and also other kind of war materials, and are making fantastic profits. And they are also engaging in repeated forays into the countryside to buy up the rice, to obtain the resources to kind of continue their industrial increase. But also there's a tremendous amount of speculation going on as prices begin to rise. And the industrialists of Calcutta, again, are participating in that speculation in great measure. And how much rice actually went into Calcutta warehouses and go-downs is totally unknown. So that pressure, though, is certainly of paramount significance. But then you have colonial policy as a whole. You have Winston Churchill's really, scathing attitude towards Indians, particularly Bengal, because Bengal is on the front of the independence movement. And in Churchill's mind, it's like George Bush, you're either with us or against us. And he very much felt that the independence movement, the Indian National Congress as a whole, the more radical elements in Bengal were enemies, and he's in a total war. So repeatedly denying imports, these are factors. There's also the factor that we see until today with the kind of divide between Calcutta and the rural countryside, where understandings of the struggles and the problems in the rural countryside are unknown to Calcutta's elite for the most part, and ignored for the most part, and pushed back into the countryside. I mean, the countryside has been going hungry really since the 1940s in many areas of Bengal. Now again, we have this crisis called COVID. And again, it's something like a war. And what we're seeing now is something similar, where any voice of economic justice or equity in distribution is being blotted out by this existential crisis. Right? Only thing that matters is fighting COVID, while you have tens of millions of people being pretty much lock, stock, and barrel excluded from the economy at this point, being rendered destitute now, a year and a half without income, without employment, without opportunity also for movement, etc. So I do think that war is the overarching factor in the 40s, but then war allows for all kinds of contingent factors
As a follow-up question to this, one observation and one question. So one observation that I had was you intentionally chose to stick to a Rashomonesque description or portrayal of the different characters in this entire saga. In the sense, it's very difficult after reading your book to take sides explicitly. Apart from, say, a Winston Churchill or a Lord Amory or a Lord Chervil, who are somewhat more black than white, all the other characters are shades of gray. You really can't take sides, and they aren't either completely white, as in a nationalistic rendering of the tale, or completely black, as such a narrative would entail. The second thing you mentioned is the lives lost due to the famine. People starved to death, and there were many lives lost due to the Japanese attack, the bombings that happened in Calcutta. One recurring theme in your description is the fact that after these lives were lost, the first emphasis of the ruling government was to identify whether the dead body belonged to a Hindu or a Muslim. And after you had this politics over the body, politics of religion over the body done and dusted, you essentially had different religious organizations taking care of their respective bodies and putting them to rest, laying them to rest as per usual traditions. So if you could just expound on this further. Yeah.
Okay. So the questions of, I assume you mean colonial officials, yes?
Yeah.
Officials working within the, you know, when you look at these colonial officials, one of the dominant factors is a total apathy. So if you look at someone like the Viceroy Lithgow, who's overseeing India at the time of the most critical stage of starvation, he's almost entirely apathetic. He's tired. He's weary of being in India. Their own country is being bombed. You know, so they're kind of armchair officials at this point. The British Empire itself is kind of collapsing. Burma has fallen. Myanmar and Singapore have fallen. Those disaffected officials are now housing in Calcutta, have kind of retreated to Calcutta. They're in their clubs, drinking their gin, riding in their, entourages, etc. So they're venal, no doubt, right? And they bear tremendous responsibility, no doubt. But the responsibility is at times as much in their lack of capacity intellectually, bureaucratically, governmentally, as it is in a directed kind of targeted sense of disdain for the people of India. You look at the governors who are rotating through in Bengal. Herbert, who is in the late 30s, early 40s. He's an incompetent, he's sick all the time. He's in and out of the hospital with dysentery. He's, having kind of all these interpersonal feuds with people like Fazlul Haq, the then Prime Minister of Bengal. And he's more worried about his kind of status amongst the other agents of empire. Then they ship in Rutherford, who's coming from Bihar. He has no experience in Bengal. He, again, is very unconcerned with the real plight or any real solution to famine. So I think that one of the, important aspects to look at is just how failing the state was. So to overemphasize a directed kind of plot to starve Bengal is to give the colonial state at the time more credit than it's due. It was a failed state, a failing state. These were incompetent people with very little training, very little experience in India, many of them. So they're bringing in then Casey from Australia. And he's trying to marshal the forces and all these. So, I think these people if we had trials for the Bengal famine, I think they would fall into that category almost of the banality of evil. You know, they're and should indeed be found culpable for their role in these things. But you have other people like the special agent who was once secretary to the viceroy, L.G. Pannell, who on the other hand, I think bears very direct responsibility. I mean, he's running the denial scheme, which, you know, denuded the countryside of rice and boats. He's very kind of militaristic and antagonistic to the people that he's supposed to be working in the benefit of. So you also have that much more direct sense of violence going on.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the picture as I saw it. You know, when I delved, especially into the archives, where you have these people's letters and personal correspondences and the back and forth between the viceroy and the secretary of state, etc. What you find is that sort of apathy and if anything, incompetence. The questions of you know, materiality of human bodies in the event of mass death is, to me, a really fascinating angle of analysis when we look at these kind of events. You know, how the state treats human bodies is a very interesting window into how they're conceived. In some way, in a biophysical manner, in a biopolitical manner, it's the most essential of all categorizations, right? The body itself. What is the body? How should it be treated? What respect should it be granted? How should it be processed by society and government? And throughout this period, really the only recognition of the bodies that you find is this categorization along communal lines of Hindu or Muslim bodies. I've talked to a number of people who are engaged in also disposal of corpses at the time in various ways. I've talked to other people as far as doctors and people who have dealt also in other parts of the world with mass death. It's very unclear how you would identify the body of someone who died of starvation, according to religious community. Assumably because, you know, there's the question of circumcision for men.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
Given the circumstances that, say, children are living in from the 1930s, so if a 10-year-old male child dies, the question of their circumcision or not is really, we don't know, you know, what level of such kind of practices were being engaged in. And then the question of women's bodies, obviously, you don't have that supposed marker of community. So as far as I can tell, those bodies that died in Mominpur, Kidderpur, Watganj, etc., Metyubruz, in Muslim neighborhoods were Muslim. Those bodies that died in Hindu neighborhoods in Bhawanipur or parts of South Kabalanji, etc., those were Hindu bodies. There's no clear distinction and way of knowing these things. And again, as in, you know, as I look at in that chapter on the bombing of Calcutta, when you have these corpses again laying for days untended. So again, the question of how you identify a corpse that is actually decomposing and decomposed at times, how you identify the religious community of that person is quite a mystery. And even the officials who are having to count bodies, they say, you know, these bodies have no labeling. We don't know when they died, how they died, or anything. The only label that's put on these bodies is Hindu or Muslim. You know, it's a very stark reflection of how the colonial state had long considered Indian bodies, right? It was the one division that they thought, you know, they could understand all of India. There were Hindus and there were Muslims. That was their kind of conception almost from the first moment they set foot in India. It was a convenient way of categorizing, simplistic. It worked for them politically very well. And by the 1940s, that singular distinction was quite well ingrained in the colonial mindset.
And it did not change
so-
with the fact that someone like a Churchill was agnostic. He was not a practicing Christian, not religiously minded. But the way you would deal with and classify Indians basis the religion did not change at all.
Right. That was what they thought the key to understanding and ruling over India in many ways. And I think when you adhere that tag to the body itself, so it's one thing to say, oh, you have this culture and that culture, right? These cultures, these two different cultures. But what I'm looking at in my work is the way that it's not just even a cultural question, it's a biopolitical question. This body itself must, and when you suggest through these processes of governmentality, in this case, the disposal of corpses, that these bodies themselves are of a particular brand, in a sense. You're branding these bodies. It's a very terrifying way to understand. Obviously, they're suggesting that this is the respectful way to deal with these bodies, but bodies that you've starved to death, you have revoked any respect for, right? So the idea that they're trying to give them their proper last rights. How about their proper first rights of survival, of sustenance, of welfare, of food, of dignity? These have all been revoked. But yet at this last minute, we're going to tag these bodies because we care so much about their afterlife. It doesn't ring all that true, actually, to me at least.
I mean, just an anecdote regarding that. I mean, I guess it's an Indian psyche in some sense, like in with respect to COVID in the contemporary time. I mean, so one of the biggest, discussion that I hear about is that, when a lot of people dies, they are kind of stacked onto a wagon or something. And that's like one of the biggest sort of outcry of the people that like this is like probably the most insane thing. I don't know, maybe it has to do something with the psyche that we have this cultural thing where you consider afterlife is like a really sort of a real thing in some sense, right? So maybe it has to do something with that. Yeah, like you have an afterlife, well defined kind of thing.
Yeah,
just a cultural thing. I don't know. Yeah,
there is that aspect as well. But what we see then in the Calcutta riots is bodies being dumped to mass graves without distinction.
I see.
So at some point, that mechanism of state also breaks down. And even if we look at the recent situation, bodies floating in the Ganges
River, yeah.
The demarcation of those bodies. And as I mentioned in my work, that wasn't going on in the countryside. That was only going on in Calcutta. In the countryside, bodies weren't being given any last rites or any kind of effect in terms of their treatment. They were, again, thrown in rivers and ponds and left to rot and left to the elements all over Bengal. I mean, the vast majority of people died without any sort of identification or care in that sense at all.
I had two questions. The first one would be, give us a sense of the Bengali politics of the time. You mentioned how dysfunctional and how incompetent the colonial administrators were, but in your research, time and again, it seems apparent that even the nationalist leaders on either side, they were less than sympathetic. You mentioned figures like Shama Prasad Mukherjee, Fazlul Haq, Surawardi, and many of them, for example, people like Shama Prasad and Surawardi, they come across as communal, constantly politicking they did not seem to care too much about the famine, and they seem to care more about pushing their communal agendas and dividing the population. And Fazlul Haq comes across as kind of naive. His government was the Bengal governor. He like schemed behind the scenes and then made his government collapse. So how was the Bengali politicians, the nationalist leaders who have since then come to be eulogized by uh, like a by a school of nationalist historians? How were they actually in the 40s? And how were these other peripheral elements that was also a part of Bengal in the 40s? For example, the revolutionary movement, especially in the rural areas. You mentioned, for example, the Tamrolipto Jatiyo Sarkar, which was very active in Midnapur, was also one of the epicenters of the famine. How did help us complete the mosaic of Bengali politics back then? That's one question. And the second question would be someone who is very conspicuous by his absence in your telling of Bengali history of the 40s is Subhash Chandra Bose. This is in very sharp contrast to nationalist historians who place Bose brothers, both the Bose brothers, as a central figure of the 40s in Bengal. Whereas in your
Subhash Chandra and Sharad Bose.
yeah, both Subhash Chandra and Sharad Chandra. Whereas in
Sharad
your work, Sharad Bose comes across as someone who is a bit, again, a bit naive and like trying to shirk responsibility for these two failed revolutions that happened in Kolkata in 1946. And Subhash Chandra Bose is just absent. You mentioned how the INA tried to make advances in Burma and in Imphal in India, and how that stirred up some public opinion in Kolkata. But it seems that his role in the greater scheme of things in Bengal and his like role in the Bengal famine, or let's say the things that preceded or succeeded it, that seems to be very peripheral and like very insignificant compared to all these other figures that I talked about. Help us understand that too.
Yeah, I think the intrigue within Bengal politics that stemming from the 1937 elections, so you have Fazlul Haq, coming to power in 37 elections with a very populist message of Dalbat. So he's, even in 37, one of the main kind of rallying cries is to provide food to the population. He has a lot of rural support at that time through the Krishak Praja Party, and then is immersed in these extraordinarily contentious politics. So the Muslim League has an extremely poor showing in 1937. They garner almost no support. Their base is in the kind of elite community in Calcutta. They were unaware of their lack of support in the countryside. So Fazlul Haq's own relationship with the Muslim League is extremely complicated. He's warring with Jinnah and others in the All India Muslim League, but at the same time needs their support in the early ministry to maintain his power. So he's brokering kind of a relationship with Fazlul Haq himself, was one of the architects of the Pakistan resolution, kind of pronounced in 1940, etc. So Fazlul Haq, I think, is one of the most interesting political figures of the time. He has this very populist kind of support, but he also plays his cards extremely cleverly. At one time is in negotiations with Shama Prasad to form a ministry at the tail end of Nazimuddin's ministry. So he's operating, and to be fair to Fazlul Haq, because of his rural support, even as early as 42, Fazlul Haq was well aware of the food situation, had in fact written a letter to the governor suggesting that there was famine in Bengal in August of 1942. So he's also extremely upset about the extent to which the provincial administration is being overridden by the governor in the name of war. So the question of the kind of deputization of several 100,000 of Bengalis into these essentially ad hoc militias, the air raid protection services, the home guards and civic guards, that's all being done by fiat, by the colonial government. And then, of course, you have the cyclone in Midnapore in October of 1942. And the suppression of the Quit India movement in Midnapore that leads to the kind of revolutionary activity prolonged in Midnapore with a separate government. So Fazl Haq, in my mind, comes out as one of the less sectarian, certainly, and more widely kind of populist of the leaders of the era. Then, you know, the Muslim League is desperately trying to drum up support. So using the issue of Pakistan, at least from 1940, that becoming more and more successful throughout the countryside. But then it's famine that really gels the message of the Muslim League in Bengal. So Sarawardi, who at that time is the food minister of Bengal, he gains tremendous exposure by running the government-run relief programs. And that is, in a sense, an outreach program in the countryside for Sarwardi. Then Shama Prasad, who really has no political currency. The Hindu Mahasabha's political currency in the early 40s is nil. They have very little political support. This is one of the reasons why, I mean, he resigns from the ministry around questions of a investigation into atrocities in Midnapore, including mass atrocities and rape of women and the kind of brutal repression of the independence movement, and then the lack of relief during the cyclone. But in fact, from outside the ministry, he's able to push his message of what he's calling a middle class, Bodrolok kind of concern, much more effectively in many ways. And again, it's famine that really galvanizes his message. So as the middle class is becoming more and more squeezed, Shama Prasad's message to the Hindu Bodrolok community is becoming more and more kind of current in many ways. So you have increasingly divisive politics, and as I really try to chart in my book, increasingly revolving around questions of famine relief, questions of responsibility behind famine, and then jockeying for position within that context. So, you know, I mean, when you think of a recession, when a country suffers a recession, the extent to which that impacts political rhetoric, or an economic downturn, the extent to which that impacts political rhetoric. You have hundreds of thousands of people actually dying of economic crime, in a sense. It's unimaginable the weight of that, the significance of that, the way that can be rhetorically taken on board is exponentially more impactful in many ways, I would suggest. So you have really these politics of the Muslim League, Shama Prasad and the Hindu Mahasabha, as well as other parties, really revolving increasingly around the food question. So, I mean, the intricacies of Bengal politics. As far as the Bose Brothers goes, you know, so much of my research was initial stages were based on oral history. What I found from the people I talked to, and indeed even then reinforced in my archival research, these larger questions of kind of nationalist leadership were not all that important in people's minds at the time. There were such pressing issues in local politics Bengal, and in local also, economic circumstances and material circumstances. So Subhash Chandra Bose is organizing the Indian National Army, broadcasting into Bengal. That certainly is giving motivation and energy to the kind of radical movement for independence in places like Midnapore, and is certainly of importance in those regards. But in reality, on the ground, Subhash Chandra Bose was absent, because he's removed, because he's not taking part in the rough and tumble of daily life and politics. People like Shama Prasad, like Sarwardi, like Fazlul Haq, they're of much more significance to the daily life of Bengal at the time. Sarat Chandra Bose also, at the time, from 42 is behind bars, so he's really, and the Congress as a whole is not of any, great significance in Bengal because of the arrest of the Congress and the Congress leadership at the time. The Congress, meanwhile, begins funneling its resources through the Hindu Mahasabha, through Shama Prasad Mukherjee. So we can see that the nationalist link up with Hindu fundamentalism, with the Hindu right, in many ways begins at this moment of famine, which I think is a fascinating kind of genealogy of what we see today in national politics in India, the kind of pride of place that Shama Prasad Mukherjee gains with the BJP, and obviously the RSS and others. That begins really at that time, the overlap. Congress was in fact very leery of the Hindu Mahasabha in the 30s, of Savarkar and others. But in the crisis of famine, with the Congress leadership in jail, they begin working directly with and through the Hindu Mahasabha at that time. So just another factor of the way that famine is increasing and impacting the communal situation.
So the lone anecdote that we have probably of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose trying to help out was perhaps he had sent out a radio signal where he wanted to help the people of Bengal with rice, but that was intercepted by the British officials and he was not allowed to help them, etc. That's the only place where he features, but that too rather peripherally. It's not very direct. So I think most oral accounts would not remember this at all.
Right. He was suggesting that he was going to get rice into Bengal through Japanese auspices. And you're correct that was not broadcast, that particular message. But Japan is also broadcasting their own propaganda, which is reaching the ground. There's that scene in Ahani Shankar, which I love so much in Satyajit Roy's film, where this newspaper reader is reading, to the probably illiterate, village in which he lives, the newspaper reports of the bombing of Singapore, and the fall of Singapore, the citadel of British power. And someone in the crowd asks, but where is Singapore? And the reader says, oh, it's somewhere nearby. So even, we have to look at, the poverty, the extent of illiteracy, the lack of information, particularly in the rural districts of Bengal. So again, how much people were even aware of what war against Japan meant, where Singapore was, what was going on in Burma, what the INA was, what the front in Assam was, or in Chittagong, or in, these, forward stations of empire. It's in Calcutta, the educated elite were much more aware of these factors outside of the immediate kind of circumstances than much of the general public.
think actually you mentioned Amartya Sen. I guess when you discuss famine, I guess like Amartya Sen probably we have to like he started this whole area of taking famine into serious discussion, scientific analyzing, right? So I mean, he often mentioned that in democracy, in a functioning democracy, famine cannot happen. So you mentioned that there are several reasons, like war is probably the most prominent along with colonialism and so on. So do you think like this is like the deciding factor could be democracy, like despite all the other factors like war and probably economic, socio-economic reasons, everything, but just a like one factor like having a functioning democracy versus like being in a colonial state. So can that be like one factor that pushed it to the verge of this extreme famine?
I pray that that's the case right now, honestly.
Right.
Given what India and Bengal is facing right now, I hope that Amartya Sen is right, and that a country that at least calls itself democratic will do the necessary to protect its citizens from mass starvation. I don't have, at this moment, great confidence in that thesis. I think it has historically held. I think the question of how democratic India is at this point is also a very serious question to ask, given the political formations on the national level. So, given the kind of authoritarianism, and again, given the nature of this crisis, which looks like a war in many ways, the kind of measures taken, lockdowns, these kind of austerity measures, and the kind of policing of the population, the kind of abandonment of large sectors of the population in the name of this crisis, the efforts to bury those realities, to hide those realities.
The denial. I guess
that's going on.
Yeah.
It's terrible. I mean, honestly, one would hope that in a democratic society, in a democratic country, that famine of this kind of scale won't happen and can't happen. But I think that demands then stewardship of that democracy at this present moment by the people themselves, and a demand for that help of that democratic nation to guarantee that contract to the citizenry of the country. And we're seeing that that's not happening. When we look at the workers abandoned on the roads of India and in the lockdown of March of 2020, when we look at the conditions following Amphan last May in Bengal, the lack of resources, the lack of concern, the continued closure of local trains that allow people to the means of subsistence, of survival. And when we look at the lack of information even about what's going on right now in the village sides of India at large, and Bengal in particular, which is always my primary focus, we don't know what's going on right now. There's very little reporting coming out. And if we look at 1941, 1942, the parallels are there and are very alarming, no doubt.
So coming back to your point of denial, right after the World War had ended, Winston Churchill had written a series of books about World War II, specifically his experiences where he placed himself at the center, right? In that, there is a specific telling phrase that he used, that of no place that has participated in this war, no one has been as untouched as Hindustan. So he, in his view of the world, he felt that Hindustan was completely untouched. It did not suffer at all, right? This is one aspect of this enigma called Winston Churchill. On the other end, when you see people like Eric Larson or Andrew Roberts, popular historians who have written about Churchill at length, They speak about things like him being very empathetic, him really taking interest in the lives of the people of his country, the fact that he had this overwhelming urge to redeem himself. As the first head of admiralty in the First World War, he led Britain to very bad campaigns in Gallipoli and Dardanelles, right? That these are the two campaigns which completely backfired. Add to this mix, you have someone like a Lord Chervil, who is a lot like Stalin's Lyshenko. Lord Chervil is a great molecular kinetics guru, and he's also a eugenicist. He believes actively in eugenics, and he's also a staunch imperialist. And the third person to this mix would be Lord Amory, who was a half Jew. He, in fact, signed the Balfour Declaration, but he did pussyfoot to quite a great deal on the response to India, what the response to India should have been. So, if you could just speak about these three personalities.
Put it very simply, I mean, Churchill was a pig. You know, he was his policies, even in World War I, he was known as the Great Famished, right? He starved Germany out and half of France in World War I. So famine was a weapon in his arsenal, food supply, always. He embraced the use of poisonous gas in the Boer War in South Africa. He had nothing but arch opinions about all anti-colonial movements. He believed in the patriarchy of the British Empire, that, you know, people, non-British people, non-European people were inferior, were less than European people. And there's no question about that. You know, there's a fascinating book by a guy named Nicholson Baker called Human Smoke, which deals with the interwar period between, World War I and World War II. And Nicholson Baker, just by using scraps of archival material, it's almost like a collage of actual kind of reportage. Churchill comes out as being a, warmonger, which he certainly was. I mean, he loved war. He very clearly declared that war was the great moment. And it ended up being a great moment for him because it vaulted him into this now intergenerational role of the great hero. But when you look at militarily, also, I mean, what happened in Southeast Asia, Churchill was warned that Singapore was undefended, that Malaysia was undefended, that Burma could fall, etc. He just simply sat on his large behind, did nothing to defend. He was not a great military leader. He was a great rhetorician. He was a great ideologue. And he was a great ideologue, particularly around war. And he came into power, he shuffled himself into power at the right moment to gain his ministerial authority during World War II. And then he, gave his nightly, sermons to the British population, gave them a great sense of morale, which was, I'm sure, important for the defense of Britain at the time and for the maintenance of British life at the time. And it's understandable in that sense why the British population saw him as a great leader, because he did lend that sense of morale to the British population. But otherwise, Winston Churchill's legacy as or even a tactician, a military leader, certainly as a human being in his sense of the human equality or franchise or empowerment is entirely dismal. And I think it's warranted that his image is changing right now, and the Bengal famine being part and parcel of that change, with books like Madhusri Mukherjee's Churchill's Secret War, to a lesser extent my own work, but I do delve deeply into the character of Winston Churchill and the extent to which his stubbornness around imports protracted famine. But it's important, I think, in terms of Bengal famine, at least, and I support the reevaluation of Churchill's image in all and every way. But I worry that the central role that is sometimes being given to him by people like Sachi Arora and others in regards to the Bengal famine is missing very important aspects of the famine, including that failure of state, including the conspiracy really of industrialists in Calcutta to hoard rice, to deny rice to the countryside, including the questions of capital and class, including questions around the ideology of war at large and the other players. And I think that, look, Amartya Sen also has demonstrated through really painstaking research and others, if there was a shortage in Bengal, it was relatively minor. And that's borne out in historical research. There were gigantic hordes in Chetla, the godowns of Nopani, in Birla's own also a warehouse related to his industrial production, etc. The Minister of Transportation of the Viceroy's Executive Council was Bengal, who then arranged all the transport around Bengal in order to bring rice into Calcutta. Rice was pouring into Calcutta this whole time, in Calcutta. And then when rations finally happened, people were being given rotten rice. Why were they being given rotten rice? Because all this rice had been sitting in warehouses while Bengal was starving at a great level. So I think it's very important to look at the detail and not to look to Winston Churchill as simply a scapegoat. Even Holocaust studies has come a long way since, you just simply say Hitler did this, the kind of understanding of layers of authority and the structure of society and many other factors are extremely important. I argue that the same is very important in terms of Bengal famine. I also spent huge amounts of time combing through the archive looking for the smoking gun, because I believe to this day that Churchill was motivated, that his denial of imports was. So what I want to say about imports is, imports would have broken famine once it had already emerged, right? The actual inception of famine is based on the retraction of supplies from the market in Bengal.
Right.
So imports are secondary at that time. I mean, they would have been critical in forestalling the deaths on the scale that you see in late 43 and 44. But the primary cause is not a lack of imports, right? That's a secondary issue, that imports would have broken the inflationary cycle, right? I've looked for smoking gun, that one memo or correspondence that says, to hell with them, let them starve, which he comes very close to saying that in several war cabinet meetings. But I think if there is a mastermind, a true mastermind behind what went on in Bengal, it is Churwell. Churwell was supposedly had total control of the food distribution globally through the British Empire. That means Australia, Canada, the entire British Empire. And Churwell supposedly had great statistical acumen and could snap his fingers, I had read in one account, and let Churchill know what the supply position was or the food position was in any of the colonies or across empire. Churwell was a real Machiavellian. He reminds me of Trump's advisor, what's his name, in the early age of the Trump era in 2016.
Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon. Yeah.
Steve Bannon has always reminded me of the professor, as he called Lord Churwell. He was some kind of nihilistic, megalomaniacal person who also had, deep kind of racist sentiment. Trusted his own, sensibilities as if they were unapproachable. And for whatever reason, Churchill is said to have been completely in his kind of influence. And Amory even says that. So the third person you ask about is Amory. Amory is, again, he's a typical kind of conservative British bureaucrat as Secretary of State of India. He's, expending some energy trying to relay the Viceroy's message of food shortage and food issues, and going to bat for the Viceroy in front of the War Cabinet, presenting statistics, etc. And he routinely mentions all discussions are scuttled by Churchill or Churchill himself. Often it's Churchill who is advising on shipping, food distribution, and blocking the imports. So Churchill is quite an arch figure. I think more historical work should be done on Churchill to kind of excavate his role in several arenas in the colonial war as well. Amory, as I say, Amory is another one of these banality of evil type of person. He's doing his best to make the trains run time and keep the war effort moving at the same time as he is trying to administer India from quite far afar. So.
Right. Soumik, you wanted to ask something? I stopped you.
Right, yeah. So just a quick comment. Like you mentioned earlier, there was this collusion between the industrialists of Bengal and the politicians that probably led to an exacerbation of the famine situation. For example, you mentioned Nolini Sarkar and the builders a lot of times in your thesis, how Nolini Sarkar was a part of the Viceroy's Executive Council and how he lobbied hard for policies that supported his business in Kolkata. And this also makes me think about whether the national leadership of the Congress, whether the reason why they were so apathetic about Bengal's suffering, whether that had to do with the industrialists and who funded the Congress. For example, Gandhi started a fast in support of sending more aid and helping Bengal, but then there were a few resignations from the Viceroy's Executive Council because of Gandhi's fast and how the colonial administration handled that. But they seem to have been very symbolic and very gestures that did not amount to any substantial policy position that the Congress adopted or that really went into ameliorating the suffering of Bengal's peasants in the famine.
It has to be said, first of all, said that the Congress is in jail at the time of the most acute crisis. So the scope of their intervention is extraordinarily limited.
So this is because of the Quit India movement that started.
Because of the Quit India movement. So they're arrested on the eve of the initiation of that Quit India movement, which I link in my work directly to the denial policy against Japanese attack, which I think is a very significant point. Quit India is often seen as a purely political kind of movement started by the Congress. But when you look at the British response, the overarching, the arrest of Congress, lock, stock, and barrel down to the local level, that's all triggered by Gandhi's suggested resistance to the denial policy. So Gandhi is suggesting that, the boat owners in Bengal don't turn over their boats to colonial authority. He's suggesting that villagers don't surrender their so-called surplus rice to British authorities. And it's in reaction to that first promulgation by the Indian National Congress that the British structures its kind of repressive response. And I teach Gandhi, and Gandhi's such a complex character, obviously, and there's so much heated kind of opinions about Gandhi from every side, and many of them, well taken and well researched. He certainly wasn't the saint that much of the West thinks him to be. But in my own research, I would have to say, and I include that long section on Gandhi's fast, he did have a very unique understanding of what the poor of India were facing at the time, real material deprivation. And when much of the Congress leadership is totally silent about those issues, Gandhi returns to them again and again. And that fast in 1943 is undertaken specifically in relation to the material scarcity that he says is stalking the land, and indeed starvation at that time. And it's not noticed by anyone. It's not reported in the press. It's not refracted in any of the other leadership. They have that leadership council and they say, well, the old man is fasting again, hunger striking again. He's quirky and quizzical, and God only knows why he's starving himself this time. So there's almost a complete ignoring even of the message that he has in early 1943 at a very important and critical time. But so much of the national leadership in both the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress, as well in the initial stages of in the Communist Party, there's very little uptake. There's very little recognition of the acute hardship that's developing and growing more and more grim by the week and then month, and mounting to a, apocalyptic, annihilating situation by, early 1943. And it can't be, the fact that so much of Congress funding is coming through industrial magnates of Calcutta, huge, and they're making huge profits. That's really buttering their bread. Birla in particular, making huge profits in Calcutta at the time. Those profits that are being made in industrial Calcutta are in direct relation to the starvation of the countryside. There can be no question. All the policies are to accentuate, to accelerate their capacity to gain access to the rice markets of Bengal. There are repeated efforts at, appropriation from the countryside, beginning with denial in April of 1942. Much of the rice that was commandeered during the denial was then, channeled through the various chambers of commerce. So you have people like Nopani and Nalini Sharkar and Khaitan and many of the industrial magnates of Calcutta who are governing those boards. And gaining this access to rice that is being commandeered militarily by the colonial government, that's all being channeled directly to the Chamber of Commerce. And then all these companies are buying on their own behalf at the same time. They're doubling down and they're going into the countryside, even when there's controlled prices, and buying at any price. And then they completely, trigger no confidence in the market system on so many different levels. So the inflation then that begins racking Bengal at the time in regard to rice is directly related to the profits being made. And those profits are dependent on these stores of rice. And they're suggesting that the rice is being, commandeered and warehoused for feeding their industrial labor force. But the amounts of rice that are moving into Calcutta, quantities that they are, there's no question that is also being held against future uncertainty and against future price rises. So in regards to speculative purchases, I in my own work, I haven't been that explicit in that. I think that historians, others need to really delve more in detail about what happened at the time. Also, some historians have argued that, well, Calcutta was short of rice, right? The mills were working at 50% capacity at that time. Again, these same chambers of commerce controlled the mill capacity of Bengal. Those mills' ownership was, again, Nalini Sharkar himself owned mills. Others within the Chamber of Commerce and in the industrial circles Calcutta also owned the mills. Calcutta was dependent not only on the rice of Bengal, of the countryside, but on milled rice in particular. This is an extremely important point. So there was a scarcity, in as much as there was a scarcity in Calcutta at certain points in time, it was a scarcity not of paddy, but of milled rice. Those mills had shut down in direct opposition to governmental appropriation of rice. So after the 1942 bombings, the colonial government went in and broke the locks on warehouses in Calcutta. Many of the merchants had, and the warehousers had, roots outside of Calcutta. They fled Calcutta and locked their godowns. That restricted the amount of milled rice available to the government. They broke the locks on those doors. Many in the Famine Commission, when they testified, including people who represented the Mills Association themselves, have pointed to that action by the government as the beginning of the real crisis in the rice trade. Because mills started shutting down, stockists started withholding from the government, hiding stocks. This fueled a huge mushrooming black market. And it was a kind of cat and mouse then and meanwhile, as the industrialists are crying poor, you have 90,000 tons of rice rotting in the botanical gardens in Shippo. Why were those 90,000 mounds of rice rotting? Because the warehouses were full. They had nowhere to put the rice at that point. And at the same time, a super important fact is, so Calcutta is dependent on milled rice. Milled rice accounts for 10% of the rice production in Bengal at that time. 90% of the rice is held in paddy and then milled locally through kind of these foot-pounding mills, denki rice. Because of the restrictions on transportation, as these corporate interests and governmental interests are going into the countryside, they're buying up not only the milled rice, because there's a shortage, there's scarcity. There is indeed a kind of choke point in the mills at the time. The mills are shutting down in opposition to the government, so there is a restriction of milled rice that can be gained in Calcutta. So they're buying up paddy. Paddy stores for 3 years, whereas milled rice stores for 1 year only. So paddy is the perfect sense, speculative, as well as hoarding kind of resource. Almost all, if I'm not mistaken, all of the records I've ever come across account for milled rice. Quantity of milled rice purchased by the government or industrial. They don't mention the quantity of paddy that was purchased at that time, and it had to be vast. So they froze that paddy in place, essentially. They purchased that paddy. That paddy then was protected by local officials, district magistrates and subdivisional officials, etc., by armed guard, by civic guards and home guards, and was effectively then removed from the markets. That is also a very important aspect to why the people of Bengal couldn't get rice at the local level, is the amount of paddy that was purchased. As I say, there are no existent records that I know of that record actual purchases of rice and paddy.
Right. So one comment to that, when I was actually reading your book, I mean, one of the thing that struck me is like significantly different from the previous works, such as as you mentioned, Srinjoy Mukherjee's work, is that your take is more from a Marxist perspective. I don't know if it's like the correct word, but in the sense that you go into this there is a big contribution of this these capitalists, where they're making like profit is being like maximized at this full stake, and at the same time they didn't care because as long as they have good profit, they did not care, right? So it's more like a class divide. And if you there is a stark similarity of today. I mean, if you look into the global scenario of COVID, I mean, every country, like you're seeing like this top people. I mean, now billionaires are like racing to the space or something, and and in India, you must have heard that there is this big businessman Adani who made like probably more money than Elon Musk in 2020, And whereas the
Mhm.
overall, this 97% of Indian, they had like less income. So it's like kind of a similar situation probably. That's just a comment that I felt like, it's kind of interesting fact.
Yeah, it's interesting. Going into my research, I was ready and eager to condemn lock and stock and barrel the colonial state. I mean, I understood before I started doing my research, colonialism at large being the main culprit. And to some large, extent that is proven true in historical research and historical sources. So, but what I also then came to understand when you look at the nitty gritty of what happened in Bengal at the time, the question of industrial Calcutta looms large. That's where, that's in whose name so much of the tax, as they were actually called, on the market happened, and they were given unfettered license in the countryside to purchase rice, to bring rice into Calcutta, to purchase paddy, to freeze it from the markets. They were given also tax benefits because they had an excess profit tax that they could write those purchases off against. So it behooved them to spend ever increasing amounts of their own stored capital on a commodity which was, increasing in price by the day. So they weren't losing their kind of investment in that way. And it becomes very clear that the centralization of Calcutta, and then in the modern day, I mean, I see that now. You see that now. I think it's something about, the CPM even. By 2011, they had lost all sight of the countryside. They had lost all connection to the countryside. Mrinal Sen was talking about this at the time in the kind of waning days of the CPM. They had lost their root, and that's true. And it had become very Calcutta myopic and Calcutta centric. And Bengal is a huge province of, multitudinous peoples, and what it looks like, what the view from Calcutta is not Bengal, as I think we all know. So the richness of Bengal, the wealth of Calcutta is still a huge drain on rural Bengal in many ways, shapes, and forms, and that continues. And I do think that was especially coined during the famine period. They were given extraordinary opportunity by the Viceroy's Executive Council, by the colonial state, with partnership with military forces in Bengal, given grants of access almost unlimited to kind of do what they wanted in the countryside. And there was severe oppression at times. That's also clear, that they bullied and kind of, forced local stockists as well as cultivators into, selling at their own price to these industrial concerns and governmental concerns. And the partnership between the colonial government and these, in the name of war, again, it's not as if the colonial government wanted to these industrialists to become powerful, channel all their money into the Indian National Congress, but the war machinery needed to be running smoothly. America was watching very closely. They had all their troops in Calcutta, moving through Calcutta, so everything,
thousands of them,
right. So these are the factors that I found out. I mean, I certainly didn't go into it with any ulterior motive to, look at these kind of structures of capital. But it's very clear that they're, deeply involved in what happened.
Right. In fact, if you follow the Bengal, like contemporary Bengal politics, I mean, at least this last election, which has happened, a couple of months ago, right? There was this huge narrative of sort of, conquering Calcutta from the countryside. That was sort of the narrative of BJP in that sense. So, there is always this divide. I guess, like, I have like, one follow-up question that I can ask that, how, I guess you partially already answered that, how this famine or like this period in 40s at large like shaped the Bengal society and politics and follow-up, like a Bengal decline of the economy and, so on. How do you see it?
In so many ways, I mean, in innumerable ways, famine remains lodged at the heart of Bengali society, politics, economy for decades at least to come, certainly in the psychological sense, but also in a creative sense. I mentioned towards the end of my book, and another thing I don't cover a lot is the question of the Communist Party. The Communist Party, during the war is supporting the Allied war effort, and, after Germany attacks Russia. So they're suggesting support for the ARP and trying to even sell war bonds, etc., for the colonial state. So that obviously didn't gain them a lot of support from the, struggling peoples of Bengal at that time who can't buy matches or coal or, clothing or anything. So who are and beginning to starve. So they didn't exactly have too much of a foothold in rural Bengal at the time. It was famine that drove, in many ways, a turn in the Communist Party outward. Rather than this very, ideologically driven, party line and inward-looking ideological framework to a outward look at the population of Bengal. So it's in light of the famine and it's in the specific context of the famine that you get people like Chitra Prasad and other artists, Govindo Ash and Somnath Laur, emerging as these icons of Bengali culture, but also as workers of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party then setting up relief in the countryside, getting deep into the countryside, making mass contact that they had failed to do. At the inception of the IPTA at that time, and dramatic productions of Nubonno and other, theater in the Bengal countryside, and music,
Right.
and Lil Chaudhry, and so much effervescence of culture. So you're changing from ideological to a much more cultural that's rooted in the welfare of the population. This gains the Communist Party, even by 1946, then, an entirely different kind of foothold in the countryside than they had in 1942. I mean, radically different, right? They then support and in many ways kind of drive the Tebaga movement in 1946-47. So the first real kind of peasant movement in Bengal, the Communist Party is able to kind of oversee. So the Communist Party won. I think that the roots of the Communist Party that comes to power then at least by the 1970s, if not before, in the United Front period. That's all the history. I think that history needs to be written. I'm working on other things, creative projects, and working much more on my own personal stories about my, very subjective stories about this period of time, family history, etc. But I really hope that someone does an extensive history of the Communist Party, and particularly in this period of time and its roots in famine. So you have that aspect that I think is very important related to famine. You have the rise of the industrial state also that I think is very directly related and importantly related. But you also have the culture of famine becoming a banner of Bengali society as a whole throughout the 50s and 60s at least. The hungriest generation of writers,
writers,
who are,
painters, Poets.
and painters and poets and thinkers and philosophers and political scientists, etc., are seeing, this sense of Bengal as the hungry nation, as being a
Basically.
kind of self-identification. But then you have also the deep enmeshment in private life. So when I came in 1999, less so today, I should say, these 20 years later, 22 years later, but in 99, famine was still very close to the home life of people. In every house, there were grandparents and parents indeed at that time, and aunties and, workers who were very eager to talk. I've studied oral history since then. I came, as I said, without any academic background, and began my work. And, a lot of oral history is about, people's reticence to talk and relive these events. What I found was people so eager to talk about this period of time, and particularly the famine, and the things that they had seen, and that phrase "ma pandao pandao bachao pandao." I want to put together a collage, a kind of oral collage of the people I have recorded. Everyone vocalizes that. It's so lodged in the memory of those generations. So I think it becomes a undergirding of Bengali culture at large in many, many ways. So, and it's interesting that today it's becoming, in a sense, more politicized. And political questions around the famine seem to be emerging, around Winston Churchill and other factors. But at least through the 90s and early 2000s, that very intimate sense of famine being a collective experience and collective recollection was there. And I think very important to how society,
Right.
functioned
Absolutely.
for many years.
Just before wrapping up, I just had one last question, which means to close. Sir, many of our listeners or viewers love books, love knowledge. So if you could just recommend a few books that you like, they may be on history or on any other subject. So if you could just give us some book recommendations, probably on this subject or on any subject that interests you.
That's an interesting one. As I mentioned, I historical books, there's so many. I mean, I think for people interested in Bengal in this period of time,
Yeah.
in particular, you have to read Joya Chatterjee's work,
Right.
And everyone should read. I think it's the most detailed analysis of Bengal politics, and particularly communal politics at that time. As I said, for me, important works were works of agrarian Bengal. Shukata Bose's work is very important in the context of the early 30s. I think there are several, people who worked in Calcutta. There's a book called Struggle and Strife in Bengal by, I'm forgetting the author, but it's a very important work. I think that people can read. Saranjan Das's work also quite important relation to this period of time. And then I read quite broadly, and I'm interested in oral history in particular. Svetlana Alexievich's work, the Belarusian writer, I think is some of the most fantastic historical work I've ever read. The work in particular on Chernobyl, what is called Chernobyl Prayer, I just think is fantastic. One of my favorite historical works that I've ever read. So I've been passing that around as much as I can. But I read also a lot of literature as well, from Kafka to Dostoevsky, And so many of the writers that are so popular in Calcutta, which the first time I came here, I was so delighted to find out the kind of popularity of all my favorite writers here as well. So those are a few things. I don't read all that much theory anymore. I used to in my school days. I guess Agamben, his theoretical frameworks on crisis and exception and emergency were important in my own work, although I don't foreground any theoretical work. Those are quite important. The work of Akil and Webbe on necropolitics and concepts of necropolitics definitely informs my work on, corpses and bodies and death, large-scale death. So much of my own training at the university was rooted in Holocaust studies because I was studying famine and everything, and there weren't really all that many people doing Global South history at the time. I ended up studying with scholars of the Holocaust, including a guy named Alf Lübke, who works on the everyday nature of Nazi Germany, which all influenced my work quite a bit. He was a mentor.
The closest thing to a famine would have been the one in Ukraine, I'm guessing. Ukraine after Lysenko's experiments in Ukraine, denial of grain, etc. Something that happened, I think, in the early 30s there, I'm guessing.
Right. Holodomor famine. I've done work with a group in Toronto that focuses on the famine. It's interesting though, because it was so top, that the very top-down kind of explanations work well in that particular case in Ukraine. Doesn't have that granular quality that I do think that often warrants in terms of historical research.
Yeah, I mean, one question just came into my mind. Well, this is the last question for sure. I mean, when you said that you first time you've been to Calcutta in in 99 when you were 32 or something, right? So I mean, how did it change you personally, as an identity? What identity did you feel at that time when you went there, and what do you feel today? And it's I don't know, probably a little bit personal question.
You end with the most complex question probably possible. In the last year and a half, I've written over 700 pages on this topic. It's the kind of one of the focuses of the work I'm doing right now. In so many ways and fashions and shapes and forms that it's impossible to enumerate them all. In terms of identity as well, I grew up as a brown person in America. That was the extent of my identity as such. My father, again, being a immigrant of that period of time and an immigrant fleeing the kind of history that he was fleeing, didn't carry cultural baggage with him in many ways. His idea was to kind of strike out anew and form his life in the absence of history. So my reconnect with that history was also very deep, also in my understanding of my father's life while he was alive, and he was away in 2002. But the work was a joint work at that time. So, learning Bengali at that time and learning about my family also, which I knew nothing about, has changed me in ways too just so complex that it's impossible to enumerate. It's also created a kind of division in my life between worlds, because Calcutta is certainly my home these days, and while the US is still a home as well. So trying to straddle those worlds, and we assume that in global period, things get closer and closer. And now, certainly during this period of time, the world has been fragmented again in ways that I could have never imagined. And the circumstances here inexplicable to my friends and family there, and vice versa. And in some ways, that has always been the case. But so much more so now with these pressing issues all around. Brief answer.
Yeah, great talking to you actually. অনেক ধন্যবাদ।
Thanks for having me. Really
Thank you so
appreciate
much, sir.
Thank you.
it. I appreciate it.
খুব ভালো
Yeah.
লাগলো, হ্যাঁ। Hopefully
Yeah.
we can like talk again about something. We are a very amateurish young forum about like just curious about different things and just for an informal chat, I guess. You know about coffee house, I guess that's why this name Coffee House Experience.
Right.
It's kind of people like a virtual coffee house, right? So yeah, it's been really great. Yeah.
No, I appreciate you all doing that, and I saw some of the other work you're doing, and it's great that you're
great.
having these informal. I generally decline academic invitations to do such
Right.
things, but do things in an informal setting and to speak more openly is awfully nice. So I appreciate you.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay.
Take care.
Yeah, take care.
Talk to you another
Bye.
time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.